Plancha. So this is a St. Patrick's Day video about Brendan O'Carroll's TV show, Mrs. Brown's Boys. I am in my new setup. We just moved, so eventually these walls will have some stuff on them, but we're in the unpacking phases. And I am getting over a cold, so if I sound gross in this video, I apologize in advance. So, Mrs. Brown's Boys is a sitcom basically created by Brendan O'Carroll out of a character that he created in a different context. I don't fully understand the entire backstory. I think this character sort of developed almost in an SNL skit type situation. And then took on a life of its own, and the entire Brown family was built out of this character. It's a domestic sitcom. The overwhelming majority of the action takes place in Mrs. Brown's house, primarily the living room or the kitchen. Occasionally they go to Foley's bar. I think on very, very rare occasions they go elsewhere, but that's basically the set that they have, is those three spaces. And it's a show filmed in front of a live audience, which I think in the 2010s, I think this started late aughts. I think the show might have started around 2008 or so, gone up through today. It's very unusual for a show to be filmed in front of a live studio audience today, I think. So that's one distinctive thing about it. They engage with the audience, particularly O'Carroll, who will regularly sort of invite audience response to particular jokes or things like that. There's extensive breaking of the fourth wall. Almost exclusively by O'Carroll. It is interesting. The other characters seem to live much more within the space of the show, whereas O'Carroll, playing Mrs. Brown, is much more actively engaged with and directly talks to the audience or to the cameras. We also regularly see O'Carroll especially go sort of between spaces on the set, like coming around. And obviously the live audience would see characters moving from one space to the next, but that's normally not televised. Normally those things are cut for the television versions. But I think it's in the first episode of the BBC series, which I guess I should clarify, because there's been multiple versions of this, stage versions and versions from different places. The version that I have access to through my BritBox subscription is the BBC Scotland version. So, I think it's in the first episode of that series, we actually see we have a scene in Foley's bar, and O'Carroll says, "Wait, where's my handbag?" And then gets up and walks around the partition between the two sets, and the cameras sort of follow him as he walks into the living room, grabs the handbag, comes back to the bar. And one of the things that is really cool about this is it seems like O'Carroll's goal is partially just to make the other actors laugh. And whereas normally those things would be taken out, like if something is being filmed live and a funny thing occurs or someone does a funny thing, sorry, normally you would edit that out. But they don't. They leave in the bloopers, they leave in many of the sort of multiple takes where someone will screw a line up and they'll redo it, and they sort of leave that in. So there is this sort of almost DIY type quality to it, right? There's this sort of it's meta televisional, televisual, I guess, right? It's very much aware of itself as a TV show. And often those things, those sort of improvisations and stuff directly involve engaging with like the camera people or live musicians or things like this. Like there's one bit, for instance, in an episode that I just recently rewatched where Mrs. Brown has attempted basically to commit insurance fraud. And when there's mention of the letter from the insurance company, there's this sort of sharp horror violins, screech, screech, screech. That probably doesn't clarify it for you, but and O'Carroll gets up, goes out the door to where those musicians are, and yells at them for doing that. And so there is that, again, this sort of delightful humor, a lot of which ends up being very meta. Being very focused on how TV shows are actually made, how they function, the movement of something like a TV show, which is a really interesting technique. And because a lot of it is sort of improvised out of Carol's spontaneous comic performances, there's a very natural feel to it that you often don't get with something that's more sort of scripted, meta. So that's an interesting element. The basic focus of the show is on Mrs. Brown's family, but really Mrs. Brown herself, this particular character. She's a very sort of absurdly domineering mother who always sort of has to be in control of things, but not. I mean, that makes it sound like it's quite a negative thing. Often for comic effect, I guess I'll mention that. She often ends up creating problems for other members of the family. Her 4 sons and especially her 1 daughter. So Kathy is the daughter. Her oldest son is Mark, who's married to Betty, and they eventually have a child named Bono. Her second son is Rory, who's, I don't think they get married, but he's in a committed long-term... No, they do get married. He gets married to Dino, who's Scottish. Her third son, maybe Kathy is the third. Kathy's either the third or the fourth. And Dermot is either the third or the fourth. Dermot is married to Maria, and they eventually have triplets. John, Paul, and Ringo, I think. And then the youngest is Trevor, who's a priest who's away on the missions, and he's not in very many episodes. So Mrs. Brown very frequently causes trouble for her offspring, often out of a desire to help, but because she has this sort of compulsive need to be in control of everything in much the same way that O'Carroll is kind of in control of his sitcom in many ways. It often creates these problems. But Mrs. Brown either resolves those problems or they resolve themselves in some sitcom fashion. And Mrs. Brown often makes these very sort of emotionally driven speeches about the value of motherhood, the importance of motherhood, or the importance of family, and things like this. So the other thing that I find really interesting about this show, this is a show very much concerned about family. Again, it's a domestic sitcom. The relationships between the performers are extremely convoluted. Like, I've charted this out, and I had to write this down. Like, I had to write down who's related to who in what ways, because this is such a sort of bizarrely insular cast. So, Brendan O'Carroll, partway through this series, married Jennifer Gibney, who plays Kathy, who's Mrs. Brown's daughter on the series. So their marriage partially involves him dressing in drag and pretending that he, the husband, is the wife's mother. I'm sure that's very healthy. O'Carroll has 2 kids by a previous marriage, Danny and Fiona. Danny plays Buster Brady on the show, who is Dermot's best friend. Danny is also married to Amanda Woods, who plays Betty, who is Mark's wife. So he's married to Amanda Woods. They are the father of Blake, who plays Blister Brady, Buster's illegitimate son, probably, maybe. And Jamie, who plays Bono, Mark and Betty's son. So O'Carroll is on the show. His wife is on the show, playing his daughter. His son is on the show, playing his son's friend. And his daughter is on the show, playing his son's wife. His 2 of his grandkids, are on the show. One playing his son's friend's son, another playing his other son's son. Fiona O'Carroll, the daughter, Brendan O'Carroll's daughter, who plays Maria, in real life was married to Martin Delaney, who plays Trevor on the show and is a producer. So that means O'Carroll's daughter was married to one of the other brothers other than the one that she's married to on the show, because Maria on the show is married to Dermot, but in Dermot played by Patty Houlihan. But in real life, she was married to Martin Delaney, who plays Trevor, one of the other brothers. Patty Houlihan, playing Dermot, is married to Emily Regan, who plays Barbara, who in the initial portion of the show is quite a minor peripheral character. She gets slightly more central in the later episodes. But basically, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 7 O'Carrolls on the show of varying degrees, either people married into the O'Carroll family or directly involved. Because the other one that I left out is Eilish O'Carroll, who plays Winnie, Winnie McGugan, Mrs. Brown's neighbor and best friend. So the people who don't seem to be related to anybody else on the show, you've got Dermot O'Neill, who plays Granddad. You got Pat Pepsi Shields, who plays Mark. And you've got Rory Cohen, later replaced by Damien McKiernan, who plays Rory, or New Rory for Damien McKiernan, and Gary Hollywood, who plays Dino. It's an interesting thing because it's a show that is obsessed with the idea of family and what it means to be a family, how family members interact, how they relate to one another, etc., etc. And that seems to be really quite central behind the cameras as well as in front of them, which is quite a strange thing. There is this sort of family business sense to the show, and it's very, very unusual. So, again, I think there's this sort of odd, almost double mirroring of the meta-ness of the show, right? The show itself has all of these meta cinematic techniques, I'll call them, because televisual, I think, sounds an odd way to put it. Sorry. The show itself draws all this attention to the ways in which it is produced as a television show, and this cast that's largely family members draw so much attention to this question of being a family. And there's this sort of doubling of the meta-ness, doubling of this self-awareness of what the show is about and how that gets played out in the performances.